And there you go. So Susan, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Jean. Are you all set?
All set.
Okay, welcome everyone. This is the third of our series that we're going to do, just conversations really about life story writing and how it connects with spirituality. And we were just trying them on to size to see who would show up. Is there any interest? And I think that it's safe to say there's a fair amount of interest. So we'll probably do these once a month for the rest of 2021. And if you have any ideas or particular topics you'd really love to see covered, you know, just send us an email or contact us, and we would love to connect with you around that. So I'm Susan Scott. I'm the person who is the spiritual life story writing fanatic. It's been my passion in teaching and writing and editing for several decades. And so I'm really honored to be able to have this platform with Awakening Spirituality. And I have to really thank everyone at Awakening Spirituality for making this possible and for creating such a warm, hospitable space where people from all over, different time zones, different orientations, different kinds of stories can come together just in a non-judgmental, warm, conversational way for an hour. So that's what I'm here to do. So I'm just going to give a short presentation. I don't want to call it a presentation. I'm just going to orient us for a few moments to the idea of what we bring into our work when we're doing this kind of work. And then I'll introduce two guests for this evening. And I'll speak with each of them for a little while. And probably around 7:30, we'll wrap up the recording part, and that will be the little capsule that gets put on the website that you can go back to and review, and you can catch material that you might have missed. And then we just open up, as Mary Jean said, we just open up for conversation. So whatever your concerns and interests are, this is a really open, friendly space. So if we can use this time to your advantage, you know, we're here because you're here. So whatever works for you would be beautiful. Okay, I'm going to show a little PowerPoint. Promise you it won't be dreadful. So here we are. This is March. Seemed like the right kind of time to be talking about getting organized and getting our writing, you know, getting into gear and kind of taking all this thoughts and images and impressions and feelings that we've had and trying to find a form. So you're in the right place at the right time. Conversations with me. I'm the host, and that's my website if you want to try to find me afterwards. Oh, let me see if I can get it. Here we go. So the first thing I try to encourage people to do if they're talking about spiritual life story and spiritual life story writing, and especially if they're really keen to publish a blog or to move into a book, or there's a kind of sense of anxiety or real drive around releasing something publicly, is just to kind of pause and say, you know, let's just take an inventory first, because spiritual life writing is unlike other kinds of writing. It's not, if you're the spiritual life writer in the room, you may be the person that other people are most puzzled by, unless you're in a group of poets, perhaps. But, you know, often people would be making a beeline for the crime writer or the travel writer or the novelist. But the spiritual life writer sometimes is still a puzzle to people. And so I want to encourage you to think about certain kinds of supports or elements that really need to be in balance for this kind of writing to flourish. And we'll just touch on these really quickly. But I would say self-knowledge, practice, craft, and community. So if you're thinking about your own relationship to spiritual writing, think about these four things, and I'll show you what I mean. The first thing I would really encourage anyone who's embarking on this is to really pause and take stock of yourself and your own relationship to writing. So this is what I would call cultivating self-knowledge. It's where you have a really frank conversation with yourself about, why do I want to write this? What is this material that's coming to the fore? Where is this taking me? And for some of us, of course, writing is core to our identity, right? If you call yourself a poet or a storyteller, a story hound, a story monger, a story vessel, there's all kinds of language for it. But if writing really feels deeply connected to who you are as a person, then that's a really particular kind of, it's a gift, but it's also a particular kind of burden. And your relationship to your stories or to your poetry or to what you're or working on other people's spiritual life stories, you're going to have a particular kind of configuration that needs a particular kind of support. And the converse of that is really interesting as well. So the two images that you see on the screen are of, let's take the one on the left, Unorthodox. That's the memoir by Deborah Feldman, who's left her Hasidic community in Brooklyn, New York. She now lives and writes in Berlin. And hers was a life lived in such a way that when she left her community, other people were fascinated by her story. So she's one of those people whose story was called out of her. Okay, she is now, in one sense, almost defined by her story, by the leaving story. Even though she's gone on to do other things, she's that woman who left her Hasidic community and, you know, whose book now has become the basis for a Netflix, as you know, a Golden Globe award-winning Netflix short series. So, but the interesting thing is, she is someone who is living her life from the inside. She didn't feel that she necessarily needed to write. Her story was actually called out of her by other people who said, oh, you must, you should. And part of it is because she came from a community that was so hidden and sequestered from the real world that people wanted to peer in. And she was our bridge in. Okay, she was the lens through which we could see things. But that has given a particular kind of burden to her, in that she's always been sort of confined then to her leaving story. The person on the right, Pam Johnson, is a beautiful writer and creative coach in the mountainous region, in the prairies and mountain-raised region of Canada. And she grew up in a family with a secret. And she was the child in the family who saw the secret, understood the secret, and became the truth teller. Okay, every family has one, a truth teller. And so her own story, as she tells us, is interleaved with the story of her family. And her spiritual journey and the spiritual practices that she's developed are directly in relation to coming to terms with and growing out of and over and developing, sort of opening up in relation to what that family secret was. So I just use this as examples to think about your own connection with writing and your own connection with your story, and how critical it is to become aware of that. Secondly, nurturing practice, what you're writing and your spiritual practice. And hopefully this is what we can talk about some more tonight. This is an image from a beautiful Toronto poet, Shanice Yanu Muhammad. And her spiritual practice is really doing land art. You can see her here. This is from her Instagram account, where she has these beautiful natural elements in front of her, and she makes things from found objects every single day. And in fact, the other images that you see are from the ashes. She builds them out of the ashes from the material that she built a beautiful piece of land art, burns it, and then uses the ashes to make art. And her writing practice is poetry, and she brings the two together in an absolutely beautiful way. And she's that kind of person who we can look to and say, wow, how do these two things come together? And that's a really important question. You know, sometimes writing gets a bad rap because we think of it as being stuck in our heads when we write. And I would really encourage you to remember that writing is a deeply embodied act, and to remember the kinds of rituals and practices that help you enter your writing practice and connect it with your spiritual practice. So where do you go to write? What time of day? What's the angle of the light? What are the materials that you take with you? What are your instruments? What are your stimulants? What are the elements around you? Is it birdsong? Is it music? Is it the smell of the trees when you open the window? Just think of these very embodied things that are part of your overall practice and how you move through the world, how these things connect with your writing and your spiritual practice as well. Third, of course, deepening the craft. This is I would say that language and spirituality they're sometimes uneasy bedfellows. right? Spiritual experience, we have typically over the centuries left it to the province of mystics, poets and musicians and artists, but often to non-verbal forms of expression, because spiritual experiences can be really profound and almost escape our ability to capture them in words. And with the rise of spiritual memoir and the interest in trying to do spiritual life writing, there's a whole group of us that are trying to come to terms with this and say, okay, if we use language to understand these experiences, what does that mean? You know, how can we do that? And the only way we can really do that is we have to really commit to the craft. And this is a screenshot from one of my favorite go-to places, On Being with Krista Tippett, as a resource center. Of course, there are countless, webinars and classes you can take and mentors you can find and writing groups. All of these things that help you develop the craft of writing are going to be important. This is Krista Tippett's On Being is a particularly benevolent, wisdom-oriented platform that I often find is a beautiful place to go, often because she interviews wisdom seekers all over the world and poets. And poets are always sort of the first in line to help us understand what to do with language and experience and how to approach it in a deeply humane way. So anything you can do to deepen the craft, do it. And fourth and last, finding community. And for anybody doing spiritual life writing, this is really critical, not just finding community generically, but who is your community? Who are your people? Where are they? And what do you do when you find them? So on the left here, we have a conventional picture of how many of us used to live our lives when we could all simply take for granted small intimate gatherings with like-minded souls, come together in an intimate conversation around books and personal experience and spend a few hours together and be able to get down to the depths. But on the right, I want to draw your attention to this really beautiful image, which is a completely different kind of emblem of community. This is one of a series of dresses. It's a kind of sculptural art piece by the Montreal-based artist Carolina Echeverria. And she has led a group of people over several years in building these dresses. And each dress is basically built, it's a living repository of stories that people donate to the dress. They donate an object to the dress, and that object carries some really deep story of their own. And often these are displaced peoples, primarily immigrants, Indigenous people who have really powerful, almost no other way to express something that's essential to themselves. And the dress becomes this sacred object. And bringing the stories to the dress and donating objects to the dress becomes a sacred time in and of itself. So each of these is an emblem of community, right? So that any individual whose story was given over to the dress doesn't have the burden of carrying that anymore. The art object carries the story. Okay, so it's a different way of thinking about community, but it's an activist-oriented way, and it creates beauty in and of itself and meaning in and of itself, and reminds us that all human stories are connected in really interesting ways. Sometimes in writing, we can feel isolated as individuals, and it can be a very lonely road. And a piece like this, like the dresses like this, reminds us that we're all deeply connected. Our stories are neighborly stories with everyone else's, and that whatever those deep and powerful experiences are that we've experienced, it connects with someone else at a really deep level. So those are the four elements I hope you'll take some time to think about with your own inventory. Self-knowledge, practice, how you can deepen the craft, and how you can find community. And speaking of community, then, I'm going to introduce you to two really interesting writers tonight. And the first one is Lindsay Machewski. And you can find Lindsay at her website there, lindsaymachewski.com. And Lindsay, I'm chagrined that I can only have the book titles, 3 of her titles. She has a 4th one coming out this month called Ontario Picnics. And we're going to actually talk about her 5th book, which she's working on, and hopefully she'll take us behind the scenes. Lindsay is a Canadian food writer. So she marries her passion, food writing, with spirituality. This is interesting. She's a food writer and newspaper columnist, a self-described mother, feminist, dog lover, owl watcher, outdoor enthusiast, and world traveler limited only by funds. So we're definitely soul sister of Lindsay's. She had me at owl watcher. And we'll come back and talk to Lindsay in a moment. And the other person I'm really happy to introduce tonight is someone in my neck of the woods in southwestern Ontario. And it's Liz Fryer. And you can see Liz's website there, arthouseattheglen.ca. Liz is also a Canadian writer and educator and a fantastic entrepreneur who specializes, I would say, in bringing the best out of adults and children through creativity and play. And you'll have some insight into how she does that in a moment. But for now, I'm going to go to Lindsay. Where is she? Lindsay, where are you?
Want me to wave? Shout?
I'm sure you're there and I just can't find you. Where are you? Ah, there you are. Okay. Fantastic. Just wave for us in case anybody has it.
Hello, everybody.
Okay. So you are joining us from Kingston tonight. That's your home base. But you were originally from England. Your family has deep, multi-generational, hundreds of years, good Yorkshire stock, right? And came to Canada when you were a young girl and have traveled extensively in all different kinds of ways. And somehow food writing, your passion for writing about food, and has sort of come together with your interest, I would say, or has led you naturally into also thinking about the deeper human story, the human spirit, and the human journey. That's how I would that's how I would start it anyway. Do you want to tell us a bit more about?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. I just finished writing a little piece about Jan Morris, who was my favorite writer. And she kept being defined all her life as a travel writer. And she balked about it every time. And I can start to see why, because I think it's really interesting, the dividing up of, what we do. And when you asked me, Susan, if I wanted to come tonight, I was so flattered, but I thought I'm not qualified. I'm not, it's out of my league kind of thing. But the more I think about it, there's little that's less spiritual than food. I mean, it comes from the earth. It provides sustenance. Everything there's nothing without food. There's no life. There's no, and I just thought, so I've been thinking about this ever since you asked me, and how deeply spiritual food is. And if we were Indigenous, if I had been, born into an Indigenous family, I would understand that. But having grown up in a kind of, European family, that's so lost on us. And it's such a shame, because it's so fundamentally important that we recognize food is the earth and we are of the earth. But anyway, so I do call myself a food writer, but truly I'm interested in food as a lens, and food in the intersection of everything, life, death, and the fact that it's the world's biggest industry and the way we make the biggest impact on the planet. I don't want to just write sort of recipes, and I don't want to talk about male chefs. That's one thing I really don't want to do, because I see food as something that's been, incredibly important to women, to generations of women, for as far back as we can go. And it's only really the 1960s and 70s when we start to get male chefs. Other than in royal households, it's the 1960s and 70s when we start to get male chefs, and they get television shows. There's the Galloping Gourmet and all kinds of them that are coming to the forefront, doing the work women have been doing for millennia. And it sort of aggravates me. So I think that's the other thing, is I am now coming at my food writing from a very, very feminist perspective. And I found that incredibly liberating. a bit of fun, but I'm careful, because obviously men have a role and it's great that they're involved. But yeah, I do think that it's phenomenal work that women have done forever, and we've paid so little attention to it until men got involved. So I've done a couple of food books, and I've branched out a little bit, and I'm going to branch out a little further. And a couple of years ago, I guess we'll probably move on to this, but a couple of years ago I did the Camino. And it struck me that food was one of the most important parts of the Camino, and nobody had done a book about food in the Camino. So that's the project that I've actually been working on it for a couple of years, but I've aborted the work on it because I've had a couple of commissioned books. So I've worked on them, and we can get back to that later. But what do you want me to launch in and talk about?
Well, I know that it's probably tricky for time. So let me fast forward a little bit here. So a couple of years ago, maybe 2016, I solicited work from Lindsay for an anthology called Body and Soul, which I was going to ask her to read from, but I'm not going to. Just hold do you have the book there? Okay, just hold the book up. Then we're going to talk about the Camino book. Okay, so
Can we just shout out Carolina? She's here.
Carolina, yeah, there's Carolina also. Yeah, exactly. Also, exactly. So
Carolina, this is so beautiful. This is the most magnificent cover.
That's right. Carolina's artwork on the cover. That's beautiful. So I know from behind the scenes that you've had this really deep interest in how all these things connect. So your next book is on the Camino. All right. So I want to get down to, you're at a very vulnerable place, as you just told me behind the scenes. Oh, you don't even really want to talk about that because it will jinx it. So, but we're in a safe setting here, and you can talk about it and find out. Well, we're just exploring. How do you take a topic that's so really a powerful experience that you've had, and now you're going to try to distill it or work with that experience in book form? Okay, so just talk a bit about where you're at with that, and we won't ask.
Yeah. Okay. So it's been a bit of a process getting to where I am with it, because I said, I got partway through twice, and then got a phone call from a publisher asking me to do Out of Old Ontario Kitchens, and then resumed work on the Camino book and got a call asking if I would do this book on picnics, which is coming out next month. So I've done those, and I interrupted the work. And I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing, although it has changed the process. So I think there's good in almost, everything that happens. At first I thought, it's going to be hard to return to, but I have returned to it. And I think that, because I've worked in doing other things, of course, the writing process deepens with everything you do. So hopefully it will be a better book for it. But what was your question, Susan? Sorry, I tend to amble on.
Okay, so imagine that everyone here has something that they'd love to work on. They have some big
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And so this is yours. And just, you can answer it however you want. What are the challenges? How are you imagining mapping it out? What are you afraid of? Just the more open and vulnerable you can be with all of us, that would be great.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I feel like it's going to be a different process for everybody. But for me, and because I've only worked in nonfiction, I do a lot of research and I do a lot of note taking. And then I start with I make a map. I love maps. So I kind of make a map of where I'm going. And in the case of, for example, Out of Old Ontario Kitchens, which was my last book, I had a map of the province, and I wrote I wanted to talk about every migrant group that had ever come here. So I wrote, the Finns in the north, and the Mennonites in the Waterloo area, and the Loyalists. And I wrote the First Nations. I identified all the First Nations around the province and wrote them in. And I thought about all the things I would need to cover and the food that was related to those people. And I sort of went along my research process. So I actually have a physical, and I know other people do this with a timeline, or they'll do it with a binder, or just there's various ways you can do this. But I find that the more sort of descriptive and physical my process is, the easier it is for me to start to fill in the gaps and start to write. I find the writing is almost the last thing that I get to. It's all the research comes first, and the permissions and the information, and then I move on to the actual writing process, and sort of as I go, that develops, and you're never quite sure what's going to happen. So I think you have to allow for a lot of creativity in that process itself, because it evolves as you go. You learn as you go.
Exactly. Okay, beautiful. So I'm going to segue to Liz, so we can talk. Because when you said creativity, that was the little that was the little moment where we're going to go over to Liz and have Liz talk to us about creativity and what she's been working on, and then we'll have a chance to open up and people can ask specific questions, because we've got a treasure trove of ingenuity here and all kinds of really interesting things to talk about. Okay, Liz, can you wave in case anybody has you on gallery view? Okay, beautiful. All right, so you have done a really interesting book of late. Do you have it there? Your 40 days book?
I do, yeah.
You want to talk a bit about how you came to that and what and how that connects with writing and spirituality for you?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm a little bit like Lindy. I was really honored and kind of humbled to be asked because I don't actually think of myself yet as a writer. This is sort of a new thing. Lindy is a writer, and this is a new thing that I've been dabbling with for the last little while. Although when I think about it, I've actually been writing my whole life and really paying attention. Personally, I write to probably help myself resolve my issues in my own head, to be honest. And so I write mainly for myself. And the book, 40 Days, Reflections Amidst Change, that I wrote last year at Lent, was my first time I've ever really participated in Lent. I grew up in the Presbyterian church. My mother told me that typically Presbyterians do not practice Lent. So, I mean, we do, but it's not in the same way that you would if you were Catholic. And my dad was an atheist, really. So I had two very different role models close to me that sort of showed me varying degrees of spirituality. I always kind of joke that I have a little angel and a little devil on my shoulders, always conflicting. So I write, I think, to sort of help resolve what's going on in my head. So I write for myself. And I really liked that you said about the rituals, because what I set myself up for when I wrote that particular piece was that I read some other people's writing about Lent, and it became something a lot more meaningful and personal to me, where I had practiced reading other people's reflections, just different things over different days. I was influenced by Sarah Bessey. I was influenced by a friend of mine who had put a book together for her church, and I was influenced by the minister at our own church who was sending out emails just of little quotes and things to think about. And I got thinking, oh, I think I could do that too. And I wonder what I would write about. And I just kind of got curious and dug in and so posted these on Facebook, these little reflections. I had already framed it up a little bit to begin with, and thought about what movements or what practices I'd encourage myself to do each day. And then kind of thought about what quotes or what word might be the overarching word for the day. And then I just free wrote about what kind of came to my mind and edited myself along the way. Mm-hmm. and just sort of forced myself into a framework of writing a little reflection each day. And then COVID hit last year and I realized, wow, this is really like powerful to be writing this at a time when so much change is happening, and then kind of put it away, didn't think about it again. And then this year when Lent was coming around, I thought, I'm just going to put it into the form of a book. I have a really good friend who's great at taking my words and things and putting them into a book form. And she made it into a little spiral bound book. She had lots of detailed questions for me. So I agree with you about community being around you. Nothing happens in isolation. So, and then I would never have been able to answer the questions that a publisher would have about font and all that sort of thing. So then I've given it to 50 women this year, and I've had a lot of really positive feedback. So I was surprised by that and really, again, really humbled and excited. So.
That's beautiful. So, and just show us, you have the physical book there, right? Because
yes, I do.
I won't have time to do readings, but it's set up in a really accessible way. And it's such a nice way of thinking of this too. So you did it as an exercise, really, almost a challenge to yourself last year.
Yeah.
And each page has, so there's an image and then there's a one page, Yeah, and there's a suggestion, a practice that people can do, right?
Yeah, that goes along with the word and the images. It was funny because again, this friend who's very detail oriented, like I had just posted images that were on my phone already, and she said, so that she was like, oh, well, you better give credit to the, you know, the stock photo artist or whatever. And I said, oh, they're from my phone. And she was like, I think you need to put that in the back of the book. So
I like that. I really like that at the back. Yeah, it's just, there it is. There they are. And you get the little behind the scenes anecdotes then about each picture too, which is really interesting.
it was really like a challenge to myself last year. It wasn't, and just like to my Facebook friends, who I don't have very many Facebook friends because I'm not really on social media a whole lot. So it was, you know, just really close friends that were kind of following along, and they were encouraging me, and that was fun.
So now 50 women have had it, you've given it to 50 people, and you're getting a response to it. So how does that impact your sense of yourself in relation to continuing? Like, does this do you feel like, okay, now you can go forward with this? Because you also do blogs, you've done a children's book, right? You have a really interesting range of things that you've been experimenting with.
Yeah. So I'm a teacher. My background is teaching, and like I said, probably writing my whole life, but not really really writing for myself. And then yeah, I actually started out, Tina Heathers is here. I want to give her a little shout out because she's been a great mentor of mine. And I started out writing a fairy tale, and I've written the first chapter. I decided that if I'm going to write, I was finding every excuse why I wasn't writing. And I finally was like, okay, if I'm going to write, I just have to actually sit down and write the damn story, really, basically. And so I wrote, I just decided I will write. I started out by writing like a weekly email, like a blog, and just for a few friends, and then just kept expanding it as I felt more comfortable. So your answer to your question is, I think as I started to feel more comfortable in my own skin and had the practice of it and the accountability to other people, and setting aside the time and sort of getting into a rhythm of it, those were all really important. And I think all the things that you said, the self-knowledge and the practice and the craft and the community, that really, really resonated with me. The fairy tale, my poor heroine has been trapped since September of 2018 in a room. I've written the first chapter, but then I went off, and where Tina comes in is like, I was like, if I'm going to write a fairy tale, I need to learn more about fairies. I need to phone Tina because she'll be able to help me figure that piece out. And then she just gave me a bunch more questions to explore, and as a good mentor would do. And I just got curious about a bunch of other things and ended up writing a children's book and writing this 40 Days of Change. And I know my heroine will be rescued, but it's going to take some time.
That's fantastic. Okay, that's beautiful. So let's pull back and open up to conversation, and then I do have lots of other questions, but I think for now, maybe we should stop the recording so we can open up to talk in general. And then, Mary Jean, do you want to tell us when you've got the
recordings? The recording has stopped, so
okay.
you can ask
away. Okay,
ask away.
I'm going to go back to Lindy real quick.